Shrikant, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Gene. Of course, we have Gene Gendel today with us, and Gene is a good friend, and I invited him over to come and spend some time with the Toronto Meetup group this evening. And Gene recently has started became a less trainer as well, on top of being a CEC for quite a long time with Scrum Alliance. In fact, he's I think one of the only certified enterprise coaches in New York City, if I'm correct. And he also runs the New York Meetup group in New York, which is a very large group with over 3,000 plus participants. He runs frequent events. I was exposed to Gene through the LESS community with my bias towards LESS as a technique to help organizations with their transformational changes. So I thought it would be interesting to bring him over to the Toronto Meetup group. So I'd invited him. So he's here today. He's been with Scrum Alliance as a CEC for quite a while, and he does a lot of mentoring for CTC and CEC candidates. So he just mentors coaches. So that's one of the activity that he does, apart from the coaching, transformational coaching that he provides to organizations. Gene's, of course, recently with the COVID situation, some of his classes are also available online. Earlier, you had to fly out to New York City to do it in person. Now you can take opportunity of that as well. So he's made it available online now. So that I will turn it over to Gene. And the topic of today is Gene's talking about the omissions of scaling, right? So eventually, there's a lot of use of the terminology called scaling. Organizations, there are various frameworks who say we are scaling. So what does scaling mean? And what are the pitfalls of the various approaches to scaling? And what do you do in an adoption or an organizational transformation? That's why it's here. So over to you, Gene. And really happy to have you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Shrikant. And let me I'm sharing my board, right? Can you see my screen at the moment? You should be able to see all boards.
Mm-hmm.
Does that show? Oh yeah, excellent. Okay, so I'm actually experimenting on the fly for the last few days. Almost going slides free. So all my stuff, training and any online presentations, I'm trying to make it fully slides free. Slides free does not mean graphics free, of course. So I'm actually using the mirror board to a large extent. In today's discussion, I would like to use my standing LESS training board. As you see, it's a 50,000 feet view from the open space into Earth. And I will zoom in on the subject that I would like us to cover today, right? So please bear with me. This is an amazing tool, by the way. I started using it, I guess, back 2 years ago at one of my clients. And then I stopped because I was no longer with that client, and kind of, COVID actually pushed me into using it again. So, but now I have my own instance. So let me zoom in on this first page. And let's try to go to, actually has a slide mode. Do you believe it? So I think Shrikant introduced the subject. And the reason why I thought this would be an interesting subject is because, well, a couple of things. I get a lot of feedback from different people from different companies, and there seems to be like a grown frustration with some of the challenges and omissions people have been facing when it comes to scaling, right? Scaling has been a pretty grossly used and misused term, and that's something that drove me towards the subject. Let's try to unpack it, and let's try to understand what's being done that causes frustration and pain to people. So a little more on that, just in a few slides. First, I'm gonna pass this through. Shrikant did, I'm never good at doing a 30-second elevator pitch. of self-intro. Shrikant did the needed. So I do various things, for pay and not for pay, and large-scale Scrum is just one of many things that I've done over my life. It's a huge part of my, toolbox, as Shrikant mentioned, but obviously not the only thing. My journey started years and years ago. First and foremost, I want to make sure I'm very transparent, and you see this here. There are various ways you can connect with me, or just reach out if you have any questions. Email, LinkedIn, my website, pretty much any page has a form submission. You can just reach out, or my free Slack channel. You are welcome to join on Slack, and just very easy way to reach me. As Shrikant mentioned, I run it is the largest and the first ever large-scale Scrum community globally, worldwide. It's pretty sizable indeed. You can join it, or I'll be always happy. I will be always happy to be your guest here, or you can come there. Some of my virtual training and coaching is also available online. So I need to remember to use the advanced button for the slide mode. 1 second. Just in passing, I'm going to mention, yes, I do teach online quite a bit. There's something that's happening later this week, starting tomorrow and for Friday. If you would like to look this up, it's on my site. Without any further ado, let me jump into the subject itself. So in my personal experience, going from company to company and servicing companies of different industries and different sizes, as well as having many more discussions with individuals that work and serve different companies, I have boiled this down to a short list of things that I personally consider as challenges and omissions, specifically with regards to scaling, but not just scaling alone. So scaling is a very grossly overloaded term. There are some other misuses and some other challenges that we see with language and terminology that's being used by others. For example, there's a lot of misunderstanding around the word enterprise these days. And as I'm sure you've seen, many people these days like putting the word enterprise in their LinkedIn profile or on their resume. To some people, it seems that if you put a word enterprise down, it means it's big, humongous, and that means it's senior, it's great. Well, truth be told, we don't have to have a huge organization to be called an enterprise. If you have a small company, a small product company, a boutique firm that has all of the various facets and gamuts, the entire spectrum of organizational dimensions like HR, budgeting, finance, operations, technology, business, it is a small enterprise. At the same time, we could be a part of a very large company, but only within the domain of technology, and that alone won't be considered an enterprise, right? Just one of the dimensions, one of the verticals of an enterprise. The word scaling in general has been, I would say, grossly overused and misused, just like the word enterprise, right? Specifically, for some reason, there is a misbelief out there that just because things are bigger, it means we have scaled. Scaling actually means something very specific. In order to scale, it almost like it means to amplify. So if you have some goodness, if you have something that you like and you cherish, if you want to have more of it, you need to try to scale it up. Just because we're doing many different activities on a larger, football field or soccer field does not mean we're scaling. Okay, especially when it comes to poor tools and techniques and processes. If we try to scale badness, we're gonna end up with badness into the power of. So we have to be careful when we use the word scaling. Scaling does not automatically mean adding more to what we already have. Of course, the foundation of bad scaling would be a mission of fundamentals, such as, like, for instance, one team Scrum. If you can't get that right, then try to scale it. You're going to scale dysfunction, and you're going to end up having dysfunction to the power of. Another classic illustration, manifestation of bad scaling would be putting Scrum in a basement of something much bigger and much more complex. It's almost like trivializing the importance of Scrum, trivializing the effectiveness of Scrum. And that's another sign that you may end up with just putting layers on top of what something that's basic, something that's very simple and good by its simplicity. Copy pasting and relabeling legacy stuff. And by the way, we're gonna unpack these statements just in a few minutes. Also, fractal Scrum with lots of local optimization. Fractal means some of you may have children, and if you have like a tube that you screw and you got symmetrical images, symmetrical crystals showing up as almost in a symmetrical way, that's called fractal. So fractalism in Scrum is something that we need to address. And another dysfunction I've seen and heard a lot about is it could be summarized as a new game with same old players. And this is often seen when you have a contractual relationship with vendors that live their own lives. They work on their own feeding schedule. They are bound by legal contracts that are very fixed, very traditional, fixed SOWs, time, a budget, and scope. And you're trying to, wrap Scrum or wrap some sort of agility around it. Of course, it usually fails. Right, so let me see if I can get this working. So here's an example of two classic scenarios of anti-patterns with Scrum. One is probably more obvious, more typical. You have number one option, you got analysis and then design and then development, multiple sprints, and then only then you have testing. So this is mini waterfall wearing Scrum garments, Scrum clothes. At the surface, it may look like your team is sprinting, but in fact, what happens at every stage, there is another team that does something, and whereas all other teams are at the same time doing nothing. Okay. Number two option is when it's most likely it's more difficult to see because at the surface it may look like you actually sprinting concurrently by multiple teams. But if you, I'm not sure if you can read this well, it says component teams, right? Component A, component B, component C, D, and E. So effectively you're sprinting along the lines of individual components. And of course, when you sprint along the lines of individual components, at the tail end, you get something that's called IOU. IOU. You don't actually have a feature, customer-centric feature that cuts across multiple components. And with that, you're going to have a lot of integration, a lot of bug fixing, and probably failing your integration. And you may have additional sprints. Sometimes you refer to them as integration sprints or hardening sprints or stabilization sprints, or I cannot go to production yet sprints. Okay.
Gene, would you be able to just zoom in into the picture alone? There's
let me try. How about that? Is it better?
Just to see, and then we can get back. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. 1 second. Let me actually fix something else here. Yeah. So that's hopefully that's gonna fix it also. Let me zoom out a little. So with this approach, you may end up having some typical fallout, such as product definition is weak. Instead of treating features as deliverables, you treat applications and components as deliverables. You end up doing Scrum efforts as opposed to actually delivering a potentially shippable product increment. A lot of this has to do with territorial code ownership. For example, with component-centric development here, you will most likely see component owners, line managers owning their own turf and not letting other components, other teams touch it. So you may think, oh, well, we cannot go across components, we cannot touch that code base because there's a private code policy, but in fact, it's defined more by organizational design and sphere of control. And there are some other challenges as well. Here's another interesting statement for you. Consider this as again, this is it's a cartoon, right? We refer to this as copy paste Scrum. It's really not enterprise scale enough Scrum. When you have many teams that are very ad hoc and very unrelated to each other, and doing different work, unrelated work, working on unrelated backlogs, or maybe even products, but very small independent products, and working for different product owners, different customer base. This is really not scaling. So again, we have to be clear. Sometimes we see this problem with organizations that are in pursuit of numbers. How many teams have we stood up? How many teams have we erected? And can we call it enterprise scaling? It's obviously an omission in the intention itself, and this may lead to some other bad behavior, such as, just playing the game and box checking, doing the box checking exercise, playing the numbers so that you can meet some end of year goals of standing up teams. Okay, instead of thoughtful, methodical team definition that is based on customer-centric journeys or product customer-centric product definitions. That's how you really should be building teams, according to what products are being delivered to real customers or internal users. This is one of my favorite ones. Again, it's the cartoon of my own design. I call it merciless plagiarism of the S model. So don't think of Tesla here. The S model is something else here. By the way, there is no such thing as S model, and I think you know what I'm referring to. If you ask the co-experiment people that have experimented with so-called S model back a decade ago, they will tell you we never called it a model. It was just our own set of experiments, and we actually recommend not using it because what made sense for us back back then when we were a 50-60 man company should not make sense for you, a large multi-thousand people financial firm or insurance company. So that's something they have to keep in mind. And what I'm illustrating here is probably a little funny, right? When you take an existing organizational vertical and flip it on its side and call it now a chapter without changing anything internally in terms of dynamics, reporting structures, management type, it's a masquerade, right? So you really just flip the power tower on its side, and now you're calling it a chapter because it's a trendy name. By the same token, you have an existing group of individuals that work very loosely coupled. They're not a true cross-functional team. They are not full stack developers. They just, what relates them together is the fact that they're reporting in the same organizational structure. Now you call it a squad. And you take this new trendy name and you shove it into a much larger organizational structure that's called a tribe. Or sometimes you can call it a fleet, because some companies feel the word tribe rubs off the wrong way culturally with some people, which kind of odd, because those very people say we don't care. As long as you don't name it wrongly, we don't care. But in any case, you end up a bunch of so-called squads working on what used to be a portfolio of activities, not even products. So you effectively are relabeling existing organizational structure with its inherited underlying challenges and problems with new trendy terminology. And of course, this is a classic example, classic illustration of scaling gone wrong, because the S model is being considered as a scaling model. But A, it's not a model. B, what you're looking at is really not scaling, just more of a copy pasting and relabeling. Another favorite one of mine, this is an example of when you may have some goodness, actually. Maybe you have some teams that actually work in the form of Scrum and would like to be customer-centric. So these few Agile teams, let's just consider these as Scrum teams, they would like to work directly for a customer, for a product owner, in a very customer-centric way. Now, this is the aspiration, but in reality, what we see is them being buried underneath under many organizational structures and layers. You got managers, conductors, coordinators. These are, again, I'm trying to use a bit of irony here. so many coordinators and orchestrators and facilitators, just many, many different layers of organizational, people that are very local optimized for their own existence, for their own role. And of course, you got multiple translation layers. And now your customer, your relationship between a real teams and a customer becomes so much longer. So layers between customer and Gemba prevent agility. They reduce adaptance, agility. And of course, questions we should ask here in ourselves, where is customer centricity here? How long, along with the many, many, many O's in the middle, how long is the feedback loop between customers and developers? That's the premise of agility, of adaptiveness. It should be very short. Here, it just cannot be short because there have so many different layers in between. How adaptive? Adaptive also means agile, fast reacting, light-footed. How adaptive can teams be really with regards to customer ever-changing needs? And what has really changed since the moment we actually introduced this heavy process and heavy framework in the first place? Again, if you're anywhere below this version, you're probably out of date, right? So you need to get an upscale there. But truth be told, this is probably not the last number. There will be many more numbers to come. And someone even made a joke. He said, if we have, maybe when we get to a very high version number, we'll just get to basic Scrum. Okay. Here's another example of bad scaling idea. And, maybe it's a little, requires a bit of deciphering. Now, these errors in the middle imply integration. I'm sorry, they imply a lot of coordination between these teams. These green circles are individual teams. This larger, error figure base shows additional coordination between these fractal designs. So each one of these constellations considered to be as a fractal design on its own. So that's what I was referring. So here you will see this analogous fractal pattern, and you might have heard the term called Scrum of Scrums, right? So here you end up with a Scrum of Scrums and Scrum of Scrum of Scrums and Scrum of Scrum of Scrum of Scrums, and so many Scrum of Scrum of Scrum of Scrums, which is effectively turns into mandatory required set of events that lead to lots of unnecessary coordination and overburden, coordinated by additional people, not teams themselves. Each team also has what's referred to as a TOO. And this is to be very clear, TOO is not a recommended term, and it's not a good thing. TO stands for Team Output Owner, not to be confused with the real product owner who is accountable for setting strategic priorities, mission, and vision. TOO doesn't have any of those rights and privileges. TOO stands for Team Output Owner, and this is not a nice place to be in. No one likes being in that role. It's a very locally optimized role, and a person is effectively responsible for having his or her team deliver more and more and more and more of output, not necessarily translating to outcome. The link here will take you to a very funny, very interesting artifact. It's the book. It's the comics book created by Michael James of Seattle. Also, there is a video link on LinkedIn. An amazing video, very, very explicit. You will love watching it because it also shows you more, more like it's an animated way to describe some of the challenges and dysfunctions you may see when you have one product owner or so-called product owner. It's really a team output owner per team. We typically see component teams having this kind of structure with used to be technical BAs or tech leads or project managers stepping into the role of a product owner. So this is something that you may want to explore when you get a chance, right? So this is not a good role to be in. This is the role of someone who is not empowered and who doesn't really have prerogatives other than having more and more and more and more output per that team. It's not a strategist, not a visionary, not a real customer rep. It's more of a someone else. It's like a leftover role, if you will. So again, and when do we see this? We see this in those situations where we have many teams that are ad hoc teams, mostly component teams that work on different applications as opposed to products, each having their own team output owner. And although you may have many groups of individuals usually reporting to the same line manager, we sometimes see people referring to this structure as scaling. And of course, this is not scaling. It's not true scaling. Next one would be, let's see, yeah, I lost my advanced privilege here, 1 second. Okay, let me just.
We want to take a pause. There's a question from Sandesh and Nancy.
Yeah, sure, we can take a question. Sure, we can take it now, please.
So Sandesh asks, doesn't microservices architecture drive to this form of team structures? Is his question. Sandesh, if you want to talk to Gene, you can unmute yourself and give him a frame of reference to the question.
Yeah, sure, I think I understand the question. Does the person want to ask, give some additional clarification?
Yeah, this, can you hear me?
Yes, Sandesh, yes.
Yeah. So this was in reference to your previous diagram where you had those PO and PO and all the interaction between the various small teams and a bigger interaction in the center. To me, it seems that, that's the architectural direction that a lot of teams are taking, which is, split up with their applications into these small microservices owned by different teams. And so I was just wondering whether that architectural direction leads to the kind of thing that you were showing in your slide.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. First, I would actually, while you were asking the question, I pulled up this recently recorded webinar where I hosted someone else from Hong Kong, specifically on the microservices discussion and why having microservices as an independent team is not a good idea. But I think what you're referring to, and maybe you can just watch it. It's there on my site. But what I would like to answer on top of, to your question, so microservice, just in a nutshell, what you're going to watch in that video, whether it's an architecture or a microservice, if it's treated as a component, and if your team, every team has this expertise internally, then it changes the game. So instead of now relying on yet another team, which is sequential down in line, as a component team, it's not a customer-centric team. It's a component-centric team. It's not a feature-centric team. It's a component-centric team. That would not be a recommended way to go. But if you have microservices expertise on the team and architecture expertise on the team, then it's a different ballgame. Okay. So this previous slide here, maybe so where was that slide? No, it was here's the slide. This is just to illustrate the very cumbersome and very extensive, unnecessary coordination that oftentimes is needed when you have so many teams that are not properly aligned with real products. Most likely, each one of these teams is a component team. And the reason why there is so much integration required is because, well, first of all, developers don't talk to each other. They rely on Scrum Masters to coordinate and on product owners to coordinate. Teams really don't talk as much to each other. But also, local optimization here is almost guaranteed because everyone is going to be looking out for their best interests. There is no single shared backlog. And what if your product is pretty big and requires more teams to work out of that backlog together? This pattern will actually break it because this design will break the pattern because each team is going to look for their own private backlog. And with individual teams' private backlog comes lots of local optimization and us versus me versus you, us versus them. Okay?
Yep, thanks.
Sure. And we'll come back to this again if we have questions. So I wanted to give a bit of insight on, so this is another illustration of bad scaling because of legal contracts. So this is probably the most classic structure that we see when we have vendor management engaged. So imagine this rectangle up here is the client company. And of course, if you have if you're reliant on the number of vendors, so here we have A, B through C through E. These vendors service your client. So a client company obviously does not work with the entire vendor base, right? They have these special people that sometimes referred to as engagement leads or vendor representatives. And these people are typically responsible for managing and providing estimates on behalf of their own people facing a client company. Now, somewhere in the cloud, there's a, this is the dotted line to illustrate this. There are groups of people that are stapled together representing different vendors. I've seen companies, client companies, I've seen them considering this as means of scaling the capability to deliver. Of course, this has a lot of flaw in it because there are a couple of dimensions of problems here. First, when you staple together these when you staple together people that represent different vendors, most likely what's going to carry forward is a sense of belonging. So these yellow dots represent people that come from a yellow vendor, and green dots represent the green vendor, and blue and so forth. So with that comes a lot of antagonism and a lot of competition and lack of ability or willingness to coordinate, to cooperate and work together. But when you have many of these, sometimes there is a tendency to say, oh, so we're scaling now, so we must be having scale. We have so many different teams. So it's a bit of an anti-pattern here. Well, actually, more than just a bit. It's a pretty serious anti-pattern here, because here we're not really scaling goodness. We're scaling that's why we have teams in quotes here. This is not a real team. This is just a group of people stabled by some sort of a, by maybe a reporting or by SOW, by some sort of a contract. Specifically, what we have to emphasize here is if you are engaging with external, third parties, you have to create an environment where they get augmented and brought internally in such a way that it's hard to distinguish between your own internal people and external people, because that is if you expect them to work together on the same Scrum team. Because now if you plug in some of your clients' people here in those teams, then you may easily end up with first and second class citizens just because people are being treated differently. So this is not to be taken lightly. If a company is engaged with vendors, to expect real agility, you have to have some very specific, very benign, very supportive conditions. Moving on to, let me introduce this. I think I've coined this term and people sometimes laugh at it. Do not confuse this with the TDD, test-driven development. That would be an amazing thing to have. But when you have what's called deck-driven transformations, when everything is based on how thick your PowerPoint deck is, this is when you start seeing these challenges. So this is another hint and another another litmus test for you. If you consult for an organization, or if you are part of a company and you see lots of agile decks floating around, thick decks with lots of prescriptive language, consider this as a DDT, deck-driven transformation, which will most likely end with at very superficial level, with some metrics, best practices documented on wiki or in box notes, but no real systemic change. Okay. I usually introduce this as a part of my any discussion that has to do with these functions. I refer to it as a triple taxation here in the States, at least. If you live in a large city, part of this, so you will pay triple tax: city, state, and government, right? City, state, and federal tax. This is my way of saying, hey, if your client company will most likely, and if you are subject to this triple taxation, you're going to end up spending lots of millions of dollars for very little improvement. So you may rely on a large consultancy coming in with a very large, big bang transformation, very superficial, very box checking, without deep systemic penetration to your organizational structure. And it's usually going to be involving some sort of a very heavy framework and lots of agile tools, right? Without real systemic, long-lasting change. Oh, and by the way, with this approach, post-COVID and during the post-COVID, impact is going to be just more, more obvious. Companies will become, and they have already become, more sensitive and more cognizant of this problem. And this is something that we hear from the field, because companies don't want to, they're kind of frustrated with this. So are there any alternatives to this, right? So we just talked about some of these challenges and problems, and, potentially, these heavy so-called frameworks and so-called models that pretty much do nothing new, but just relabel, refurbish, rename existing complexity, and don't really change anything systemically meaningfully. Let me say this, before this entire industry has become so agitated and so intoxicated with the need of scaling, and the word scaling has been introduced the way we know it now, maybe I'd say 4 or 5, 6 years ago, it wasn't such big of a saga, before 5, 6 years ago, but there was something has been created and nurtured and experimented and researched for much longer than that. So there was XXX something, I'm gonna use it just as a way to describe it, XXXX something has been referred in the first book that was written back in 2008. Of course, it was based on some previous knowledge and some previous experience, so we can roll back another 5, 6 years. More specifically, large-scale Scrum is that XXXXX, what I'm referring to. Large-scale Scrum, and it is effectively Scrum that is executed by multiple teams working on the same product, servicing the same product owner. That goes back way back when. So the first book was written in 2008, and then there was another in 2010, and only in 2016 there was a third book written by Craig Larman and Bas Vodi. It had no intention at any point in time to become a commercial framework or commercial product. And some very successful frameworks that literally made, I'm sure they've made millions and millions and millions of dollars to those that have coined them and have been selling them. Large-scale Scrum was just a huge body of knowledge and experiments and experiences collected over many years. But in 2015, it was actually formulated into a large-scale Scrum framework as we know it today. Now, in large-scale Scrum, just to be clear, it's not a scaling framework. It is important to understand, and let me just take a look if I have this interesting slide that describes the same. Somewhere I had it, and I may no longer, so I will pull it up from my other database of many slides. I guess I did not transfer it yet here into the mirror canvas. But just to paraphrase, I'm going to say this to you. Large-scale Scrum is not about scaling. Large-scale Scrum is about descaling. It's about descaling organizational complexity so that you can actually grow, nurture, hibernate something that is useful and meaningful. That is, you would be scaling goodness. So in large-scale Scrum, a single team is considered to be an organizational building block. And in order to, so if you like what one single team does, by removing organizational debris or organizational structures that sit in between those teams, you are able to scale up to X number of teams working on the same product out of the same backlog for the same product owner. This wouldn't be fractal. This wouldn't be hidden under many different organizational layers. You wouldn't be relabeling, renaming existing groups into so-called feature teams or Scrum teams. You would be doing something very authentic and very genuine, taking a single team that works as Scrum team and creating more teams of the same kind. And that would be amplifying goodness of one single team. This is, so just going back to this slide for a second, tons of history, 600 plus experiments that have been documented over many almost 2 decades. It's got principles, it's got frameworks that are sometimes also referred to as rules. Has many guides, the soft guides that are recommended in order to support that are needed to support your frameworks, and many different experiments, up to 600 plus. If you ever decide to read any of these books, I would recommend starting with the Green Book. It's just easier to read and makes it more structured for you. This is a graphic illustration, very simple graphic illustration of what LESS framework, large scale Scrum framework, would look like. You could have up to 8 teams potential here. We have illustrated only 3. Some of large scale Scrum events are specific to those individual teams, and quite a few that are shared by whole teams or by teams representatives. Now, this discussion is not about a deep dive into large scale Scrum. This was more about some of well-known scaling dysfunctions as we know them. Of course, to learn about Scrum, there are different ways you can go about this. You can either learn it on your own or maybe attend training. So there are many more dimensions through which you can proceed, and those dimensions where you can dive in for further learning. But I'm just going to throw this at you. One thing to remember: large scale Scrum is Scrum. It isn't Scrum underneath many organizational layers. In large scale Scrum, a single team is considered to be a organizational building block. In large scale Scrum, we have every team that is practically a clone of another team. So it's not a component A versus component B versus component C. Not like that. It is team A, which is a cross-functional team, and team B that is a cross-functional team, and team C that is a cross-functional team. So each one of these different teams is almost like a mirror image of the other team in terms of skill set and capabilities, functional skill set and domain knowledge. There's a lot of very intimate, very close integration and coordination that takes place between teams directly, as opposed to going through multiple organizational layers and layers of translation. Again, just as a sneak peek, as an anchor to further conversations, teams refine together, they plan together, they coordinate directly. In large-scale Scrum, there are no managers. Just like in Scrum, there are no managers. If in large-scale Scrum managers do exist, their role is very likely to change. They turn into educators and mentors and coaches that teach specific disciplines that are experts at. And if such expertise does not exist, then we don't have these managers around because they really don't have any value to add. Large-scale Scrum, just like Scrum, is a self-organized organizational structure. This is another graphic illustration what these teams may look like. Here you have 5 teams. You don't necessarily have to have exactly the same size. Some teams could be slightly bigger, some teams could be slightly smaller. Ideally, obviously, you want to have all teams of roughly the same size and the same capacity and skill set and domain expertise, but things may vary a little bit, although each team should be able to deliver a feature or a backlog item from soup to nuts out of the backlog. Depending on team size and capacity, maybe output would be higher or lower, but all in all, each team is autonomous and independent. Now, keep something else in mind. These bubbles you may read and interpret whichever way you want, but there's so much coordination and support and working together that happens directly between these teams. Lots of promiscuous programming, lots of pair programming, lots of dog and ponies. We have other dimensions in large-scale Scrum through which lateral learning takes place. We have huge emphasis on communities, on real communities that are formed by volunteering, disappear if no longer needed. These are not vertical towers flipped horizontally because we want to be trendy with some fancy terminology such as chapters and chapters of chapters or guilds. No, in large-scale Scrum, in fact, we use the term community as bare bones, and it means a community, just like a meetup. You can join the last meetup, or you can leave it. Only one product, defined identically for all up to 8 teams. Only one product owner, no multiple product owners. Only one product owner who sets mission, vision, scope, strategy. There could be a handful of users and stakeholders that help with clarification. We strongly recommend delineating between clarification and prioritization. In large-scale Scrum, it is super critical. We discussed this in more detail during training, for example, but just because we usually get this question, well, how can one product owner support up to 8 teams? That's like what, 3 to 9 people on the team. We have up to 8 teams working in a less product group structure. Then what, we have 70 people. How can they support that? Well, it depends what you ask them to do. If you ask them to manage your Jira or push around stories or do all of the writing on those tickets, they're going to lose their essence and they're going to lose their mind on day 3 or maybe on day 2. But if you're reserved to what a product owner should be doing as per Scrum and less, then this may not be as traumatic and dramatic for them. Okay. So I would like to actually reserve no less than 10 minutes for our conversation, right? I think we have until, Shrikant, do we have until 7 or 7:30?
We penciled in until 7:30, Gene.
Okay, so well, I would rather iterate on some of these by Q&A.
There's a question from Ron, if you want to get to it first. He asks, does it mean it needs to be pure Scrum or no Scrum at all? Ron, you want to articulate?
Sure. So you were talking about, I like the idea that you're saying that you come up with your perfect Scrum team and then you look to repeat. But then in organizations that I've worked for, we've taken an approach like that. And then in some cases, we've gone further, like almost try to create exact replicas, but then for whatever reasons, those teams can't actually act in a pure Agile or Scrum way. And so then you get this hybrid approach. Does that mean that, well, then you get these arguments, well, you're not doing Scrum, and then the focus starts becoming arguing about whether it's Scrum or not versus whether you're actually improving the outcome.
Well, I think I would actually pick from the latter part of your question, or the latter part of your statement actually is what I would like to stress. So personally, I wouldn't, if I were, and I've been to these situations as well, I wouldn't so much be worried about, are we doing pure Scrum for the sake of doing pure Scrum? Scrum has been designed for a very specific reason, for a very specific purpose and intention, to deliver products to customers and do it in a customer-centric way. When something isn't working, so if something that works very swiftly and very smoothly in one area or on the one set of conditions and does the job, but does not work in the other in a different environment on a different set of conditions, I guess the first question I would ask: are we actually understanding, assessing why it's not working? So it's not so much for the sake of doing Scrum, but what is it that is preventing it from working? So, and then this becomes an organizational design problem. What exactly is currently preventing?
Yeah, and I've seen it being part of a problem with the architecture of the product. If you get more of a monolithic design of a product, and yet you're trying to, you have 10 teams working on delivering to customer requirements, then sometimes they would battle over common components, right? In an object-oriented world where, because they're not fully microservice, they haven't broken everything up. And so now you get this competing thing, but we're still, we're trying to be pure Scrum. We argue about that, but what the team is benefiting from is going through and doing big room planning, bottoms up, top down, bottoms up type, evaluation and work agreements, et cetera, but being able to be pure Scrum and then, work in a perfect world, then sometimes the code, for instance, can even get in the way.
Sure. I mean, so none of what you have shared, Ron, is unheard of. These are standard challenges companies face. So I guess the not such a dramatic answer that I'm going to give you, I think it's pretty basic. So well, we don't have to be intentionally purist or intentionally overly dogmatic because this is this is written somewhere in the holy book. What I would say though is that 99.9% of the time, the reason why we see organizational resistance to be a little more specific, resistance coming from middle management is because by challenging existing traditional ways of operating, we're challenging some locally optimized internal power towers. For example, if you work for a large financial company and your entire technology group sits within the same CTO tower and you have multiple components, and every component, every application, for example, has its own component owner. Now, we're not only challenging how work flows and what is called as so-called product, we're challenging someone else's turf and control. So
Absolutely.
these component owners will be very eloquent and very verbose explaining why it is not possible to give up their 10 developers of backend Java to mix them up with 8 developers of front end and maybe a few Oracle database guys. To them, those team structures effectively are it's a matter of territorial control. So, like for instance, in large scale Scrum, and this is something that has to do with organizational design and structure, but there's another aspect of it, of course. Like for instance, in large scale Scrum, one of the biggest things that we do up front, by the way, large scale Scrum, we don't flip an entire organization overnight. So we do flip a switch at one point. And by the way, org structure in less, 70 at most people on development side, plus maybe a dozen or so, maybe a few dozen on business side. But that's aside. We actually do a lot of prep work. In my experience, it takes a few months at least to do like a runway. We have to educate everyone. We have to define what our real product is. And this may take some time. So unless we have a proper product definition, it would be impossible, premature for us to discuss what a team should look like. Because if we decide this is our product and then we have a team built around this product, and then it turns out it's just a component of a bigger product, then we will be sprinting within that one component and maybe delivering these technical stories, and your entire backlog is going to be like a bunch of technical things, right? And but in the end, you're going to have to integrate it with something else. So super critical, like for instance, in large scale Scrum, we have to first educate everyone and understand what is it that we are developing facing a real customer. And then we have to understand who is a real customer. It could be an externally facing customer. I'm sorry, if it's external product development, most likely you're going to have a real customer who pays you money, hard cash or whatever the currency. Or you might be developing something internally, in which case you will be facing up against internal users. And again, I'm kind of all over the place, but when we teach less, we actually touch these dimensions in more details. We need to find proper people also representing, becoming a product owners, depending on what type of product ownership, depending on what kind of product development you run. But clearly, and again, we teach a lot of system modeling and system design, not as in application development, but organizational as a system design in less. And we teach people see the whole. And what we oftentimes people realize is that some of these ill-defined team structures is because of the organizational structure design. So you have to, that was a very good question.
Very good answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, it's not, that's why less adoptions, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's complicated. I think that's what you're getting at. It is complicated.
It is. So in order for this to work, we need to talk to real users and real customers. We can't, if we talk to surrogates, if we treat some operational manager or, a PMO for some bad reason as a customer, then we're going to end up with a very ill-defined product definition, in which case this whole conversation about customer centricity and value stream mapping and business centric development and user story mapping and all that customer centric goodness goes right out the window because we don't talk to real customers. Even in large organizations like financial technology groups, sometimes it's super tough to get to a real product definition just because there's so many different systems involved. Well, then in which case we have to do our best to expand our product definition as reasonable as possible. And we sometimes get the question, how come we have 8 teams, up to 8 teams in large scale Scrum? Well, it's by trial and error and based on research and experiments. Typically when we have more than 8, it just becomes even more difficult for one product owner to own it. And it's just really hitting those Dunbar numbers, the limits. And that's where we phase off. But 2 to 8, it's the reasonable number to be within. And it's not one product owner per team. That makes it a TOO, team output owner, which is a bad thing. We want real products to be managed by real product owners. So that's, all of that is actually a part of the up to a few months typically it takes to assess and to prepare your organizational structure for a flip to become a less product group. And it's super critical also, on point, we need to have explicit informed consent from senior management. Not in writing as you would do with an attorney or a medical doctor when you sign your consent, but you need to have a very explicit okay from a senior manager or senior management that they're willing to roll up the sleeves and do enough Gemba and go to where action is and make some organizational changes that are pretty important for healthy dynamics. It's totally not okay for them to say, here's a $5 million check, go figure out, hire a bunch of so-called agile coaches with their enterprise and scaling their name and just come back in a year, tell us where we are. We're gonna just sit here and watch. No delegation, they have to be involved neck deep. And that's why it is not an easy business. It's not an easy proposition. Many of these, even senior managers, they're just there for a ride. They want to, stick around long enough before they jump to the next ship. So you really need to go, you need to hit where it hurts and look and go where there was a state of urgency and go where action is, right? So of course there are some great managers, some great leaders, true leaders out there that would not take it lightly, but the flatter the better, we say, our organizational structure. Flat, not totally flat, but every time we do less adoption, we need to bring our organization to what it, flatter than what it used to be. Which becomes almost, I'm going to argue, this is my speculation personally, with, COVID situation and everyone going online and some other challenges. I think it may become inevitable for organizations to reconsider the way they are structured and the way they operate. Imagine you have a convoluted structure that with multiple translation layers and everyone is online now. Try to go figure out who's doing what and how long does it take you to get to the protocol, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
Yep.
That was good. That was a good, any other questions? So in fact, the last few slides are more of a, I wouldn't want to parse them line by line because these would be just a little too dense. These are some of the less rules, hard rules that are strongly recommended not to bend, although some of these will be naturally bent these days. Like for instance, number 3 here on the 2 collocated, guess what? Challenging now, but not just for less, for one team Scrum, for any organization that does anything. But my argument would be the leaner, the nimbler you are from to begin with, the simpler it is to adapt, right? It's almost survival of the fittest. I'm maybe biased, but Scrum and other true agile ways of working are more resilient, more resistant to adverse effects of market and of the market in the current situation. Oh, this is all going to be all available to you anyway. You can refer to these. Let me zoom out, maybe see. So any questions, folks? I would like maybe to give you some snippets, some other ideas. Maybe this is an interesting.
There's a question from Pavit again.
Please.
He's asking for, can you share some stories from your experiences with less implementation at a company? So we don't implement, we do adoptions.
Sure.
Yeah, but Gene.
Let me try to share some of my personal experience. So first of all, actually, I'm not trying to promote Miro, but one way or the other, companies you work for most likely going to be using some version of this tool, or maybe Mural, or there was another tool. I'm just actually enjoying what I'm doing right now. Let me zoom in on this part, and I'm going to answer the question. This may actually shine some light. Here's an example of, well, let me get here. So here, what you see is what I was just referring to. Feature-centric development will deliver business value. Ultimately, you can monetize it. When you develop in components, each component is going to give you just an IOU. IOU something, which isn't never final. You have to integrate and staple it together. Now, let's imagine you're at the large organization that has historically component-centric development. Each one of these components, for example, is an application, right? For a large investment institution, it's usually the case. Not a single application by itself is a product. So that's why it's so difficult to find a real product owner. Who's going to care what you deliver per component number 1, or component number 3, or 4, or 5? So all of these snakes or worms, I call them, these colored lines, potentially are products. But in order for you to call it a product, you need to cut across multiple components, right? I'm going to use one as an example, product number 1 as an example. I'm sorry, product number 8. In order for it to be called a product, you need to cut through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different components. And then you can find a real product owner who's going to say, oh yeah, if you give me all of these components together as a feature, I'm going to be able to prioritize one feature against another. Because now we're talking product-centric work. Not 1 against 2 against 3 against 4, but entire stack, entire cut through. This is a great exercise to run during that pre-assessment phase. I call it a bricks and snakes, or worms and stones, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. 2 ways you can deliver it, right? Team 1 does component 1, then team 2 does component 2, and etc. That's mini waterfall. That's very sequential. You don't want that. Or you can do this. Team 1 does all 6 components. Team 2 does all 6 components. Team 3 does all six components. It doesn't mean you need more people. Most likely, you already have those people within your organization. And it's more about how they're structured and how they work together. You have to keep apart. You have to take apart reporting structures of component teams and restructure them as feature teams. And that's an organizational design decision. That's why we need senior management to be engaged. To your question now, I'm going to skip over this slide, which effectively talks, you have to expand your product as much as possible and constrain it when you feel that you have exceeded what up to 8 teams can do. Actually, this is an example of a real scenario at the XYZ organization that I serviced. There were 3 components. 3, they were called CAP, COM, and CAR. These are arbitrary names. There was a case study you can read about this. Each so-called product was obviously developed by, component team. Team CAP, team COM, team CAR. These are just, abbreviated names. Now, imagine how much integration and how much coordination needed to be taking place and needed to happen in order for this work to be delivered. In fact, even after changes were made, our definition of a product was still relatively weak because of organizational design limitations that were bound by a single CTO tower. But what we were able to accomplish was this. We were able to build out teams that would cut across multiple components, and instead of being called CAP team or COM team or CAR team, it would be CAP COM CAR team 1, CAP COM CAR team 2, etc. We then actually expanded. I'm not sure if I have a slide for this, and we added more teams, 2 more teams. So we ended up with 5 teams working, cutting across the entire zoom in again. Cutting across the entire stack of CAP, COM, and CAR. So this is a clear example. You may ask what this was. CAP was capturing documentation data, COM was communicating it, and CAR was storing it. So there was 3 different steps in the process. So we actually expanded the definition and made it much wider. And for that, we needed to cut across these silos and artificial boundaries of us versus them. We did not actually need to go and find any new people. Everyone was there. They were just reporting into their line managers, and those line managers were asking to work on stuff that was less trivial, less important of, trivial effectively from a standpoint of our real customer, our real product owner. We were able to find much quicker a person to step into the role of a product owner when we did this. Because imagine how difficult it would be to find a business person who would be able to prioritize CAP against COM against CAR. They can't do that. Each one is a technical chunk. So hopefully that helps a little bit. That was that.
Yeah, it sure does. Thanks, Gene.
This is just one example. I mean, you can, This exercise. Yeah, so go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so what are some of the challenges you faced while introducing this kind of approach? Because of course there is pushback, as you said, from the middle management. Does that mean they were moved into a different role, or is it just that they lost their?
Yeah, let me see if, so there was one slide that actually eloquently summarizes one thing that's so critical in large-scale Scrum adoption. It's called, we have to separate job security from role security. I forget where this slide is. I need to actually make things in better order here, put the things in better order here. But you're absolutely right. We have faced some critical challenges there. Specifically, there were some people that were inherently resistant to these organizational design improvements, because to them it meant, what does it mean for me?
Right.
Am I losing my control? Am I losing my turf? This is the slide I was looking for, right? Job safety, not role safety. There's a quote from Upton Sinclair. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his job depends on not understanding it, right? So those are your line managers and tech leads. So it became a responsibility of senior management to make sure these people did not feel feared and threatened. Now, again, I can't really describe through the whole case study. I can share it with you, but there was still remnants. There were still leftovers of this bad, bad sentiments and bad blood. But to a large extent, it has been addressed by making these people feel special in a better way, specifically turning them into mentors of those respective components. I think 1 or 2 people were actually able to roll up the sleeves and get on the teams and start working alongside with the teams. Now, what really kills some of this initiative is that people feel, okay, well, I've been working as a manager, as a lead for the last 7 years. I've been trying to climb up my organizational structure, and now what? And now I'm stuck because I cannot progress in my career development anymore because I'm being asked to actually do work. Mm-hmm. But in large-scale Scrum, we actually take this very carefully. We approach this from the angle, are you willing to maybe either polish up your skills or maybe step down on the team, and if you already have skills, if you still have skills, are you willing to come down and actually produce value? Mm-hmm. Or maybe if the answer is no, it's not me, I'm no longer responsible for coding, maybe you want to go to a different part of the organization and do something that's more traditional. Mm-hmm. And if none of this works, then the company your organization needs to make a decision, because now, are you optimizing for a single role or are you optimizing for the whole? That's why in large scale Scrum, we put so much emphasis on global optimization versus system optimization. We this is probably requires more explanation, but if you have everyone only worrying about themselves, they can be pedaling very effectively in different directions, and you're going to have a zero-sum effort.
Right.
Like, for instance, here's a classic example of of such a case, right? You got 3 component teams working on individual component out of the same backlog, so it seems, but Team C works on item number 6. From a standpoint of a product owner, it's very low in priority. Why? Well, because this team can only work on that component and nothing else. And it's called local optimization. And with this comes, of course, this classic challenge of meaning waterfall analysis, design, and implementation by 3 component teams, and you have testing. If you come from the standpoint of economics, although Agile is not about making things cheaper, then you realize that the level of overhead and waste that it's being produced by a system like this is just amazing. It's just humongous. So of course you need to make sure right people hear right messages. And as I mentioned, large scale Scrum, we start with this. The adoption started with an informed consent. You need to make sure your senior management, we discussed this in more details when it comes to management discussions last. We need to really make sure people, senior management understands what it actually takes to change your organization. These are pretty serious conversations. But in those instances where they are really interested in improving, they will give you tons of support, and they will go a mile with you, more than a mile. Really
yeah, I'm sure.
Otherwise, it's this problem, right? So we really have to eliminate this. System components, single specialty workers, but you got little tsars, little kings protecting their turf. This is mine, don't touch it. This is Larman's laws of organizational behavior 1 and 2. Organizations are inherently optimized to protect status quo of single and first and second line management. And you have to address it with care. Otherwise, you end up rocking the boat too much, right?
True.
Yeah. So, any other questions? We kind of.
Hi,
Yeah.
this is Ron. So you mentioned 2 to 8 teams per product owner. What about Scrum Masters 2 teams?
Oh, good question.
Ratios?
So you know what? I'm loving using this because I don't have these slides prepared. Otherwise, in my PowerPoint deck, I wouldn't. But here on the board, I have it all. Let me illustrate something to you. In large scale Scrum, a Scrum Master. Let me look at that slide. Here it is. In large scale Scrum, a Scrum Master is a full-time job role, full-time dedicated role. Absolutely, you must have organizational design support, specifically in HR. There must be a role that defines a Scrum Master. Or if it's not in HR, within that organizational structure where less is being adopted, senior management must be very cognizant and very respectful of the role and very conscious about what this role entails and what kind of expertise it requires. In large scale Scrum, this person would be a team level coach who is very seasoned and who is very well versed. I don't like using my cartoons too much, but this is my cartoon describing a fast tracker coach who just wants to get the higher paid. He jumps from the old role to I'm junior Scrum Master and I'm a squad level Agile coach, and next thing I'm going to have a tribe level coach title and I'm going to have a bigger bonus. Kill this idea altogether. This is a much better way to develop. But to your point, up to 3 people, up to 3 teams are recommended in less. Scrum Master could effectively support up to 3 people in less. Sometimes it could be a little more, a little less than that, between 1 and 3. So if you just flip into less and you have more need for team level support, then maybe it's a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 ratio. No more than 1-to-3, because even at 1-to-2, it could be a full-time thing. 1-to-3, it's the max. So roughly, if we have up to 8 teams in large scale Scrum, by experiments, it would be recommended to have at least 2.5, 3 Scrum Masters supporting your less product group. And over time, the focus of a Scrum Master will change. It will go from product owner and teams. It will digress over time. And also organizational design, because we erected and put it up in place from the beginning. It will over time increase and grow in the dimension of development practices and organizational design. So that's why we need someone who is a full-time person, seasoned, well-versed, well-educated, just a good person, a strong person who really well understands Scrum and less. We cover, of course, much more about this when we train, when we deliver training, because there are some different dimensions that a Scrum Master needs to know how to address, and that becomes just a
Just to add something to that, is since the Scrum Master, the cadence of the multiple teams are the same. If you have 8 teams or even 10 teams or 20 teams, the Scrum Master is a shared coach for supporting multiple teams. So generally recommended between the ratio of 1 Scrum Master to 3 teams. So we do not recommend a Scrum Master for each team.
That's right. So we will have up to 3, and depending on team maturity, you may potentially shift focus and shift intensity of support. Like for instance, in my case, where 2 more teams were added to a less product group when it expanded, because the customer said, we want more of what you do, just give us more. So we had to add 2 more teams. One of the Scrum Masters who was aligned with more seasoned teams was asked to pick up the other 2 teams that were brand new teams, because there was more expertise required there. Yeah. What else do we have? Maybe any other questions? So there's so many different graphics, so don't worry.
There's a question from Ming Lam about whether the Miro board will be shared, or is it exclusive?
I will share the slides only that were meant. So the column that you saw, I actually have a PDF uploaded on the site. So I will.
Sure, if you can send me the link, I will send it out to the group.
I will upload the video as well, and I'll share with you and others.
Absolutely.
I'll share with you, and you can share with others.
Sure, certainly, Gene.
Of course, all of these slides, it won't be impossible to share because they came from different sources, like different decks. And this is actually in preparation to the class itself. It just so happens that some of these are relevant to our discussion today. In fact, if you want to take a look at what large-scale Scrum learning journey would look like, you know, if we did this in a comprehensive way, this is, you know, I guess I need to zoom out a little and then zoom back in. So, you know, it's okay. Probably it's not an easy way to do it. There was no easy way to do it. So when you talk about structure, products, sprints, history, causation, correlation, we make a strong emphasis in large-scale Scrum study on being able to understand the whole, understand the system. And some of these exercises and some of these examples that we give helps people see the whole. And once you are able to see something, it's almost impossible to unsee. This is a classic learning experiment, learning example in large-scale Scrum. For instance, if you have a team, you have a goal, or organizational goal to get rewards. So there was a pressure to game the numbers to get rewards. Everyone who has been subject to monetary incentives through performance appraisal would know this is true. So the value of your reward, you know, $5,000 versus $50,000 will drive you in gaming the numbers. And I would be just as big of a sinner as anyone else. If you are dangling a carrot in front of my nose and says, oh, if you achieve this, make this achievement, I'm going to give you more money. That's what people are going to do. This will also lead to pressure to try actions for higher feature velocity. Why do you think all of a sudden teams start buffering their estimates, and it used to be 30 story points, now it's 50 story points worth of work? How did you achieve that? Well, you just inflated the estimates. You just gamed the numbers. Okay. Here's an example of, you know, the degree of measurement dysfunction is going to be much higher if you game in numbers. The more you game numbers, the more dysfunction you're going to have. And your ability to improve the system is going to be lower. O stands for the opposite. One of the big elements of understanding less is to understand the whole, understand the system, how different system variables operate, and how they relate to one another. Okay. Okay. Any other questions, folks? I'm happy to wrap it at this juncture.
Yeah, someone had a question around what is Gene's site. I'm just posting the link. Chat.
Yeah,
We'll be sending out an email as well. So Mark, keystepstosuccess.com is Gene's site. I have put the URL in the chat, but I'll also send a follow-up.
I actually have the link here already for you folks. So let me share. I prepared the page, so I will be uploading the video there as well, but the deck is already there. It's PDF, as a matter of fact. I just didn't want to give it to you because then you would be pasting the deck, not listening to the conversation. So you can download the deck from here. Pretty much all of the slides there, with the exception of those that I went to ad hoc. And I'm going to upload the video here as well. Okay.
Can I ask a question on architectural and technology runways and how that fits into less?
I'm sorry, on what?
How do architectural, architectural level and technology level runways fit into less?
So, good question. So, first, so once we define a product and once we understand what skill set and domain expertise and technology involved would be required to get to our definition of done as per product definition, then now it becomes a question of how do we, so now we have internalized all of the knowledge within the less product group. Now it becomes a question, how do you coordinate between different teams? And how do you make sure that every team has enough knowledge of a specific domain or technology? So some of less events, of course, I'm just showing you graphics. I'm not discussing what each one of these is, would be support of this. As far as, let me get to the technical aspect of this discussion. We oftentimes leave it. So every team in large scale Scrum shares, there's the lowest common denominator of sharing definition of done. We got to be careful about not confusing unfinished and undone work. Definition of done grows over time. We try to remove what's called undone departments. We have to have a discussion about that. What prevents it from going to real, production mode? That's why undone and unfinished is not the same. And we just make a very strong emphasis that intellectual and technology excellence is super critical in large-scale Scrum. Without CI/CD pipeline, without test-driven development, without continuous integration, without developing, maybe if you're familiar with head of the trunk as opposed to multi-branching strategies, it's critical, right? We want to make sure we have good technology in place and good technologists in place, and that's why we don't just dispose of these more senior people that are great and maybe they understand technology really well and they are used to be maybe technology, those component leads or component owners. We actually turn them into component mentors. There's a bigger conversation behind how this is done and what do you need to do for someone to be willing to become a mentor and an educator. We strongly relate on the concept of developer traveler and developer scout. This is a lot of term. I need to explain to you what it is, but these are ways of cross-pollinating with knowledge and teaching others what you know. So,
but if we're building out and we have a product definition, and we're looking 3 years into the future of things that we need to start working on now to disrupt our own business, right? For the next breakthrough, would that type of work be given to another Scrum team, or is that something you'd break out
what's
and have another.
What's interesting in what you just described, that new opportunity, this new strategy, this new dimension of work may call upon what's called less huge. This may be translated into a very new independent requirement area that requires lots of research and investigation. And of course, this is just a sneak peek, right? So you may have less product group as you know it, area number one. And with this description you just gave, there might be a need to define another product area, requirements area number two, which is a completely independent from development perspective. However, from strategic high level perspective, it needs to be prioritized against that original area. So we sometimes refer to this as you have to spin off one area, you send off a lead team there. So there are methods. There are methods to do it. You erect an area de novo because you have a completely new requirement coming from the third world country market, or maybe because your existing product definition has grown so far that you now need to spin off another area because you keep growing, and it's like you cannot no longer consider it as a one product. It's just become too big. Okay, so but it has been accounted for, of course, for very large products.
I mean,
Okay,
architecturally, there's a big difference. I think when you use the word architecture runway, I'm presuming it is something that you're referring to what Scaled Agile talks about. In actual architecture in large organizations, there are only two things that matter. One is an intentional architecture of what your architecture is going towards over a period of time, but you don't build it today. And then you build as an emergent architecture, taking it towards the direction that you have envisaged. For that architecture, all the team members are involved. There is no specialized role that one person owns an architecture and another person instantiates. So if you have 8 teams in a structure, or you have 20 teams, the 20 teams together model the necessary emergent architecture that has to emerge in the next few sprints, 1 or 2 or 3 sprints,
right.
2-week sprints.
Yeah.
But isn't that still for a currently existing product? Like if you ever listen to Jeff Bezos speak, or listen to how Google does their product development, they have things, and they would do more sustained innovation to keep their current products moving forward. But both Google and Amazon, like AWS, what they'll do is they'll be working on technology developments that they know that are going to provide value 5 to 7 years out as well, right? Or fits along what through business strategy called like a 3 horizon. So
yeah, you're not talking about labs, right? You're not talking about labs that create new replacements for what is already there. So again, it all depends on the product definition for that particular organization, the context. There's always, if you look at Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, there's these existing
one of my favorite books. Okay.
Yeah, and then there is the new product cycle and the S-curves that replace the existing one. There are multiple ways of doing it. You can delegate the new S-curve to the existing team itself. It's possible. It can be done by a separate R&D team outside and then integrated, or it could just be a new product or services that sunsets. But again, it depends on context. If you look at Gmail as a product, for example, in the last 8 or 9 years, it has gone through internally 7 iterations to completely revamp the internals of that system. Even though for us, Gmail is one product outside, it has completely changed architecturally over a period of time, which is unknown to us as the user per se. So how you get there is a function of how you spin the teams and get to that location. There are different ways of doing it. There's no one right answer to that, right? So again, Amazon is more of a loosely coupled architecture in terms of microservices. So they are built by feature teams. What they consider features, very narrow component-centric features, which is different from how Google defines products. So there's no one answer per se, Ron.
Okay, yeah, that's very good. Yeah, I think I have Crossing the Chasm. I haven't heard that title in a long time. I think it's on my bookshelf though.
Mhm. So
Thank you.
context matters. In fact, just a sidebar for at least those who are on the phone. Next session, the large scale Scrum session we have is I'm bringing Ben Moiser, who is going to do a session on introduction to Wadley Maps. And Wadley Maps is a strategy planning tool which allows you to envision such architecture changes. So you'll find it very interesting how you can evolve from an emergent kind of situation to a situation where something has become completely commonplace, like in the cloud and it's disposable technology. So how do you invest? How do you invest in new or structured products or something that's become standardized? So you would probably get the answers. We do have Ben coming for an introductory session on Wadley Maps, September the 3rd in the evening. So that's the next session that we have in Les Toronto.
Excellent. Thank you.
And that again is a tool. So Scrum is a container. If you take large scale Scrum, is using other methods to do other things. So for example, we use impact mapping to decompose a backlog. So or you could use even Wadley mapping to decompose the strategy and use large scale Scrum to build it. So it kind of provides the structure for other methods and practices. So Scrum, fairly misunderstood, is that Scrum by itself doesn't do anything. You still need to add product management. You need to add deep technology practices on top of it, like TDD and CI/CD, and other practices like BDD and ATDD. So similarly, you can add on practices like story mapping or impact mapping or Wadley mapping to the portfolio on top of Scrum in order to get the benefits that you're looking for.
Thank you for making this more, enriching the conversation, Shrikant and everything. So are we? So I'm actually looking at the clock. I actually need to wrap it for my.
Sure. Sorry, Gene, you've gone ahead as well. Thank you.
No. It's all good. It's all. I mean, I'm happy to answer more questions. In fact, I think I mentioned my Slack channel is available. So if anyone wants just to ask, quickly anything, they just. Well, I guess this is a JPEG, so you won't be able to, but it's available. Just ping me if you want to be added. So this isn't something I can do by force. You ask me if you'd like to be added, and I can simply add you to my Slack channel. It's easy access.
Thank you, Gene. So anyone wants to join Gene's Slack channel, please, we will send you the links so you'll have access to all these.
Absolutely, yeah.
Except the only challenge, nowadays I find Slack a big challenge because I'm already on about 30 of them. And it's getting to be a clutter to find the thread you want to talk to.
Yeah, I agree with you. Same here. I have like 4 or 5 groups and I'm trying to keep it low. But the docs is there. I mean, some additional artifacts are there, like you have some other plays, things to play from Dave Snowden, from the Spotify model, from Evan Campbell. Oh, shoot, I need to update the name. It's Evan Campbell. So stuff is there for you. Okay. Feel free to reach out if you need to. Okay.
So thank you very much, Gene. I appreciate it. I think you went a little beyond time as well.
Yeah, by all means. And if people feel like they want to join me tomorrow, or Thursday for Wednesday, or maybe they know some colleagues that would be interested in the same, they can just, it's available off that page right here.
Sure.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, well, thank you all for chatting and great questions.
And thank you very much, Gene, for being here and taking us through this today. So appreciate it a lot.
Absolutely. I'll share the videos with you, and well, it's going to be here where it stands right here. Okay.
Okay.
I'll reshare the link here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Pleasure. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.